Welcome to Heartfelt Revenge Stories. Well, see, I never imagined that a single family lunch could push me toward a decision that would quietly redraw the rest of my life. My name is Rebecca. I'm in my early 30s, and until that afternoon, I still believed that keeping the peace was worth almost any personal cost. Almost. We were barely halfway through the meal when my father finally said it out loud. Calmly, firmly, as if he had rehearsed it in his head long before we ever sat down at that table. You apologize to your sister, or you accept the financial consequences. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, just certainty, cold, unwavering certainty. I asked what consequences meant even though I already knew. Deep down I knew. He answered without hesitation, without even blinking. I would be removed from the family trust. I looked at him. Really looked at him, waiting for anyone to interrupt, to soften the words, to suggest another option, to say this had gone too far. No one did. The silence at that table was suffocating. I felt that familiar pressure building in my chest, the pressure to explain myself, to justify what had happened, to defend my side of the story one more time, to make them understand. Instead, I said one word. All right. It landed heavier than any argument I could have made. Heavier than tears or shouting or pleading. Just two syllables that changed everything. My father nodded, satisfied, convinced the situation was under control, that I had finally learned my lesson. That order had been restored. Please subscribe and like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. That night I packed my clothes, my important papers, and the few things that actually belonged to me. Just me. Things no one could claim or take back or say were given conditionally. I didn't leave a note. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't wait for permission. I closed the door behind me without looking back. And oh God, the sound of that door clicking shut, it felt like freedom and terror all at once. The next morning my phone rang before I'd even finished my coffee. I was still in that strange fog, that disbelief that comes after you've done something you can't undo. The voice that came through was sharp, breathless, almost frantic. Please tell me you didn't trigger that clause, he said. It was the family lawyer. His name was Martin Hale, and I'd only met him twice in my entire life. Please tell me you didn't, he repeated. Because if you did, your father no longer has control. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my lips. What? Rebecca, if you walked away, if you triggered the protective clause, everything changes. Everything. If you want to understand how a single word unraveled years of quiet pressure, how a family built on control collapsed in less than 24 hours, stay with me. Because this story doesn't end where my family expected it to. Before everything finally broke apart, my family had always operated within a structure that felt predictable, orderly, and quietly restrictive. So quietly restrictive that you didn't even notice the cage until you tried to move. I grew up in a household where calm mattered more than fairness, where avoiding conflict was treated as a moral responsibility rather than a choice. When tension appeared, it was smoothed over quickly, sometimes so quickly that the real issue was never addressed at all, never spoken, never acknowledged. I learned early that keeping things pleasant often required someone to stay silent, and that someone was usually me. My sister, Vanessa, was the center around which many decisions quietly revolved. When mistakes happened, explanations were offered on her behalf, often before she even needed to ask for them. If her words caused friction, they were reframed as misunderstandings or stress responses. I noticed how quickly concern replaced accountability, how easily consequences softened once emotions entered the conversation. No one ever called this protection. Yet it functioned exactly that way. My father believed deeply in harmony, though his version of harmony depended on compliance rather than resolution. Whenever disagreement surfaced, his response followed a familiar rhythm. He would ask me to be patient, to be flexible, to take the long view for the sake of everyone else. He framed compromise as maturity, even when it consistently required the same person to step back. Over time, his requests stopped sounding temporary and started feeling permanent, inevitable. My mother supported my father's decisions with consistency, though rarely with enthusiasm. She believed in unity, in presenting a stable front, entrusting that things would balance out eventually. When I looked to her for reassurance, I usually received gentle reminders about family loyalty and long-term thinking. She didn't dismiss my feelings outright, but she also didn't challenge the system that kept producing them. Silence became her way of maintaining peace. Money and financial support were never discussed as tools of control, yet their influence was always present, always there, hovering over every conversation. Assistance came with expectations that were never written down but always understood. Independence was praised in theory, though discouraged in practice when it threatened the existing balance. Choices that aligned with family preferences were met with approval. Those that didn't were quietly questioned until they felt impractical. Impossible. Over time, I learned which paths led to comfort and which led to distance. I adapted by becoming self-sufficient in ways that were easy to overlook. I learned not to ask for validation, not because I didn't need it, but because it rarely arrived without conditions attached. I handled problems on my own, solved disagreements internally, measured my success privately. Each time I stayed quiet, the pattern reinforced itself. And each time I adjusted, the expectation grew stronger. This dynamic didn't explode overnight. It settled into place slowly, reinforced by small decisions and repeated compromises that felt harmless in isolation. I didn't see it clearly while I was inside it, because it had always been there, shaping my responses before I even realized I had choices at all. But that afternoon at lunch, every boundary I'd ever set was officially crossed. And what happened next forced me to choose between my family and my sanity. That afternoon, every boundary in my family was officially crossed. What was supposed to be a normal family lunch shifted the moment the conversation stopped being casual and turned pointed, sharp, deliberate. My sister Vanessa announced that she had already decided to sell one of the family properties, that the paperwork was being prepared. There was no hesitation in her voice, no pause to ask for input, just a statement delivered as if the outcome had already been agreed upon by everyone at the table. Except it hadn't. I asked when this decision had been discussed, because I hadn't been part of any conversation about it. Not one. Vanessa responded that it was unnecessary to consult everyone when action was required, especially when delays caused complications. I tried to stay measured, calm. I explained why the sale raised concerns that couldn't just be brushed aside. The property had long-term value, unresolved obligations, financial implications that affected more than one person. I asked where the numbers were coming from, who had reviewed them, because transparency mattered when decisions carried consequences beyond convenience. Vanessa dismissed those questions almost immediately. She said I was overthinking details that only slowed progress, that I was creating problems where none existed. The exchange escalated quickly once she shifted from defending her decision to attacking my intentions. She said I had a habit of complicating simple matters, that I always needed more explanations, more discussions, more time. She claimed that my involvement made everything harder, especially when decisions required confidence rather than hesitation. I responded that accountability wasn't the same as obstruction, that rushing forward without clarity often created damage that couldn't be undone later. My words barely landed before my father stepped in. He cut me off mid-sentence. His tone was firm and unmistakably final. He said this wasn't the time for debate, that Vanessa had already handled the situation appropriately. I attempted to explain that I wasn't questioning authority, only the process. He didn't let me finish. He told me that challenging my sister in front of everyone was unacceptable, that it undermined unity, that my refusal to fall in line was becoming a pattern he was no longer willing to tolerate. I asked why concern was being treated as defiance, especially when the decision affected shared interests. My father didn't answer that question. Instead, he reframed the situation as a matter of respect. He insisted that loyalty within the family required restraint. He said that disagreements should remain private, that public opposition created division, that my behavior was forcing him to address an issue he'd ignored for too long. The conversation stopped being about the property and turned into an evaluation of my role within the family. That's when he delivered the ultimatum. Without raising his voice, "You apologize to your sister, or you will be removed from the family trust." The words were clear, deliberate, and they left absolutely no room for interpretation. I waited for clarification, For a softer version, for someone to suggest an alternative. None came. Vanessa remained silent, watching, her expression steady and expectant, almost satisfied. My mother didn't interrupt. She chose instead to look down, as if the moment would pass more quickly if she didn't engage with it. I felt the familiar pressure to concede, to say what was required, to restore calm. The expectation was clear because it had been reinforced so many times before. Apologize. Smooth things over. Move on. This time, the cost of compliance was stated openly rather than implied. And that honesty changed something inside me. I realized that the issue was no longer about disagreement or tone. It was about control being asserted without question. I said quietly, "All right." The words settled over the table with more weight than any argument I'd made. My father nodded, satisfied that the matter had been resolved. Vanessa relaxed, confident that the outcome confirmed her position. The lunch continued in strained silence, though the decision had already been made. Nothing else was discussed because nothing else mattered. The lines had been drawn clearly, and for the first time I understood exactly where I stood. That evening, the threat from lunch became real action. The house felt different after we returned. Not tense in a dramatic way, but settled, as if a decision had already been absorbed by the walls. No one revisited what had been said at the table. There were no raised voices, no attempts to negotiate, no signs of hesitation. My father moved with quiet certainty, making phone calls behind closed doors, sending messages that were never meant for me to see. I didn't ask what he was doing because the purpose had already been stated clearly enough earlier that day. By the time night settled in, it became obvious that this wasn't a cooling-off period. My father had taken concrete legal steps to remove me from the trust, acting as if authority alone was sufficient justification. There was no follow-up conversation, no explanation offered, no opportunity to respond. He operated under the assumption that his role gave him the right to act first and clarify later, trusting that consequences could always be managed once compliance was restored. My mother didn't intervene. She didn't challenge the speed of the decision or question whether it was appropriate to move forward without notice. She remained silent, offering neither agreement nor resistance, which in practice allowed everything to proceed as planned. Her silence carried weight because it confirmed that this wasn't being treated as an emotional dispute, but as a corrective measure. The absence of doubt from her side made it clear that legality wasn't a concern anyone felt obligated to address. That realization landed slowly but firmly. This wasn't a temporary conflict meant to bring me back in line through pressure. It was a punishment designed to reinforce hierarchy, to demonstrate what happened when expectations weren't met. The shift from argument to enforcement was deliberate, and it stripped the situation of any remaining ambiguity. I understood then that the family wasn't waiting for reconciliation. They were moving forward as if the outcome was already justified. I stayed quiet throughout the evening, not because I was uncertain but because there was nothing left to explain. Any attempt to argue would have been interpreted as defiance. Any attempt to appeal would have been framed as weakness. I recognized the pattern too well to fall into it again. This wasn't a moment that called for persuasion. It was one that demanded clarity about my own limits. Later that night, I packed my belongings with care, focusing only on what was necessary. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. Each item I chose reflected a decision to step away without spectacle or confrontation. I avoided shared spaces, avoided conversations, avoided the impulse to justify my choice. Leaving quietly felt more honest than engaging in a discussion that had already been settled without me. There was no final conversation before I walked out. My father didn't ask where I was going. My mother didn't stop me. Their lack of reaction confirmed what I'd already understood. In their view, the situation had been resolved, and my presence was no longer required. I closed the door behind me without making a point of it, because I no longer needed to prove anything. Only after I left did the full weight of what had happened become clear. The conflict had crossed a line, moving beyond family disagreement into legal consequence. What began as pressure at a lunch table had evolved into an irreversible action taken under the assumption of unquestioned control. The emotional component had been stripped away, replaced by formal decisions that would carry lasting effects. I didn't feel anger in that moment. What I felt was recognition. The system I'd spent years adapting to had finally shown its limits. And those limits didn't include space for me unless I complied completely. The quiet of that realization was heavier than any argument, because it confirmed that the relationship had shifted into something that couldn't be repaired through conversation alone. But what I didn't know yet was that my grandfather had anticipated this exact moment. And what he built into that trust was about to turn everything upside down. The next morning, a single phone call changed the entire balance of power. I'd barely settled into the quiet of a new morning when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another attempt to pull me back into a conversation I was no longer willing to have. Instead, I answered, not out of hope but out of habit. The voice on the other end introduced himself as my grandfather's attorney, Martin Hale, and he spoke with a level of urgency that immediately set him apart from everyone else who'd contacted me recently. He explained that he'd been alerted to activity involving the family trust late the previous evening. His tone was measured, professional, but there was no attempt to soften what he was about to say. He told me he'd spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the original trust documents in full, including amendments that hadn't been discussed openly within the family. According to him, what had been attempted wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a discretionary decision. It was a direct breach of the authority granted to the people managing the trust. This was the first time anyone had taken the time to explain the trust to me in clear terms. Martin outlined why my grandfather had created it, emphasizing that its purpose wasn't control or leverage, but long-term protection for specific beneficiaries. The structure was intentional, designed to prevent impulsive decisions driven by family conflict rather than responsibility. Until that moment, I'd only known the trust as something spoken about vaguely, always framed as a privilege that could be taken away at any time. He then walked me through the clause that changed everything. The document explicitly stated that I could not be removed as a beneficiary under any circumstances unless I personally submitted a written request to withdraw. There were no exceptions, no discretionary loopholes, no authority granted to override that condition. The language was precise, leaving no room for interpretation or emotional justification. Hearing it explained so plainly felt like stepping into a room where the lights had finally been turned on. Martin was careful with his words when he spoke about my father's actions. He didn't accuse him emotionally. He didn't speculate on intent. Instead, he stated the facts. By attempting to remove me without my consent, my father had violated the terms of the trust and exceeded his legal authority as a manager. That violation was significant enough to trigger serious consequences, including the potential loss of his role in overseeing the trust altogether. As I listened, it became clear that what had happened was no longer a family disagreement framed as discipline. It was a legal overreach, with documented evidence. The trust wasn't designed to reward obedience or punish resistance. It was designed to outlast personal conflicts. And my grandfather had anticipated exactly this kind of misuse when he put those protections in place. I asked Martin what this meant for me, expecting complications or conditions. His answer was calm and direct. My status within the trust remained unchanged. No paperwork filed against me had any legal standing. More importantly, the attempt to alter my position had created a record that couldn't simply be erased or explained away later. The line had been crossed, and it couldn't be uncrossed. When the call ended, I didn't feel relieved in the way people often imagine. What I felt was clarity. The family hadn't just tried to pressure me emotionally. They'd acted on the assumption that power excused legality. That assumption was wrong. The consequences were no longer hypothetical. And for the first time, I understood that the system my grandfather built wasn't fragile. It was firm, deliberate, and now fully visible to me. I sat with that realization quietly, knowing that nothing would return to how it was before. The truth about the trust had changed more than my understanding of money or documents. It confirmed that the boundary cross was real, measurable, and no longer something that could be dismissed as a private family matter. 1 week later, the tone inside my family had completely changed. The first message came from my father. It was brief, cautious, and noticeably softer than anything he'd said before. He didn't accuse me of anything. He didn't repeat the words he'd used at the lunch table. Instead, he asked how I was doing, suggested we talk soon, framing it as concern rather than authority. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, he was choosing his words carefully, as if every sentence carried weight he could no longer control. My mother followed shortly after, though her approach was different. She didn't ask about my feelings or try to reconnect emotionally. Her focus was practical, almost anxious. She mentioned paperwork timelines, uncertainty about what might happen next. It was clear she was no longer thinking in terms of family discipline, but in terms of exposure and risk. The confidence she once had in my father's decision seemed replaced by unease, and she asked questions without expecting clear answers. Vanessa reached out later that day. When she spoke, the certainty she'd shown at lunch was gone. She didn't defend her decision anymore. She didn't insist she'd been right. Instead, she talked around the issue, acknowledging that things had escalated faster than expected. She admitted that selling the property had created complications she hadn't anticipated, that the situation now felt unstable in ways she couldn't fix alone. Hearing hesitation in her voice was new, and it revealed more than any apology would have. Over the next few days, the family attempted to reset the narrative without addressing what had actually happened. Suggestions were made about meeting privately, keeping things informal, avoiding outside involvement. The language shifted toward compromise, even though no one openly acknowledged the violation that had caused the panic. They spoke as if time itself might undo the consequences, provided everyone agreed to lower their voices and stop pushing forward. I listened to all of it without responding directly. I didn't agree to meet. I didn't reject their offers outright. Silence became my only answer, not as a strategy but as a boundary. I was no longer willing to negotiate. Each unanswered message seemed to increase their urgency. Follow-ups arrived faster, phrased more gently, layered with reassurance that no one wanted conflict anymore. What they didn't seem to understand was that the absence of my response wasn't confusion or hesitation. It was clarity. For years, I'd been expected to react quickly, to explain myself, to smooth things over before discomfort spread too far. This time I chose stillness instead. That stillness shifted the pressure entirely, forcing them to sit with the consequences of their own decisions. As the week went on, the imbalance became obvious. The more they tried to regain control through conversation, the more exposed they felt. Without confrontation, without raised voices, the dynamic reversed. They were waiting on me, adjusting their tone, measuring their words, and reconsidering choices they'd once believed were final. By the end of the week, nothing had been resolved. No agreement had been reached. No understanding restored. Yet the change was undeniable. The authority they once assumed was gone, replaced by uncertainty they couldn't manage. My silence didn't repair the family, but it revealed the fear underneath the confidence they'd relied on for so long. What happened next wasn't just about money or control. It was about a system built to protect people like me from people like them. And that system was about to prove itself in court. A few weeks later, the dispute was no longer contained within the family. What had once been framed as a private disagreement now existed in written filings, official notices, and legal language that removed any remaining ambiguity about what was happening. I learned that the protective clause embedded in the trust had been formally activated, not through emotion or persuasion but through procedure. The mechanism existed precisely for situations where authority was exercised beyond its limits. And that mechanism didn't require my consent to move forward. My father was formally stripped of his role as trustee after an internal review confirmed that he'd acted outside the scope of his authority. The decision wasn't presented as punishment, but as enforcement. The language was cold and precise, describing violations of fiduciary duty and unauthorized actions that directly contradicted the governing document. For the first time, the power dynamics that had shaped my family for years were irrelevant. What mattered was what had been signed, recorded, and legally binding. I was named as the successor trustee according to the original terms. The appointment wasn't symbolic. It wasn't optional. The document stated clearly that if the acting trustee breached specific conditions, control would pass automatically to the designated replacement. Reading that section felt surreal, because it reframed my role entirely. I was no longer the person expected to accommodate or absorb decisions made by others. I was now responsible for ensuring the trust was administered exactly as intended. My parents responded quickly by filing a lawsuit to challenge the change. Their claim argued that I had manipulated the legal system to gain control, that my actions constituted an abuse of legal protections. The filing didn't deny that my father had taken steps to remove me, but it attempted to reframe those actions as justified responses to conflict rather than violations of duty. The complaint relied heavily on intent and interpretation, suggesting that authority within the family should outweigh strict adherence to legal structure. From my perspective, the argument missed the point entirely. The trust wasn't a family agreement built on preference or hierarchy. It was a legal instrument created to prevent exactly this type of unilateral control. The protections weren't activated by my emotions or reactions, but by documented actions that crossed defined boundaries. I didn't initiate the process out of retaliation. I became part of it because the structure demanded continuity and accountability. The case entered formal court proceedings soon after. Hearings were scheduled. Filings were exchanged. Timelines were established. Everything moved at a pace that felt both slow and relentless. Each step reinforced that this was no longer about reconciliation or apologies. It was about interpretation of law, adherence to fiduciary standards, responsibility under binding agreements. Throughout the process, I maintained a deliberate distance. I didn't reach out. I didn't explain myself. I didn't attempt to justify my position emotionally. My role required clarity rather than persuasion. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was alignment with the reality that the dispute had shifted into a domain where feelings held no authority. The day of the final hearing arrived with a strange kind of calm. I sat in that courtroom, surrounded by lawyers and documents and people whose entire lives had been built on the assumption that they could control me. And I realized something. They'd never actually seen me before. Not really. To them, I was the accommodating daughter, the one who bent, the one who stayed quiet. But sitting there, holding the documents that proved my grandfather had built protection specifically for someone like me, I understood. He'd seen me. Long before I'd seen myself. The judge reviewed the filings methodically, asked pointed questions, examined the original trust language word by word. My father's attorney argued passionately about family dynamics, intent, misunderstandings. But the law didn't care about passion, cared about what was written. When the judge finally spoke, the words were clear and final. The trust's protective clause had been properly activated. My father's removal as trustee was upheld. My appointment as successor was legally sound. Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. The courtroom went silent. My father sat rigid, staring straight ahead. My mother's hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Vanessa looked smaller somehow, like something fundamental had been taken from her. I felt nothing and everything all at once. Not triumph, not vindication, just the weight of finality. What came after the verdict wasn't reconciliation. It was the slow, permanent fracture of a family built on control rather than love. And sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. After the court hearing, no one in my family was able to keep the position they once believed was permanent. The ruling didn't come with drama or raised voices, yet its impact was unmistakable. The court upheld the decision to remove my father from his role as trustee, confirming that his actions had violated the terms he was obligated to follow. There was no ambiguity in the judgment, no room for interpretation shaped by family hierarchy or intention. The document spoke clearly, and the law responded accordingly. My father didn't speak to me after the ruling was announced. There was no apology, no attempt to explain his choices, only a visible withdrawal that carried more weight than confrontation ever could. The authority he'd relied on for years was gone, replaced by a legal reality he could no longer influence. My mother remained silent as well, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful distance that suggested she understood how final the outcome truly was. Whatever unity they once believed they controlled no longer existed in any meaningful form. Vanessa lost more than she expected. Without the protection she'd always assumed would remain intact, her influence faded quickly. Decisions she once made without question were now subject to review. The privileges she'd taken for granted quietly disappeared. No one announced this shift aloud. Yet it was evident in the way conversations stopped including her, in how certainty left her voice. The safety net that had surrounded her for so long was no longer there to soften consequences. The family itself fractured in ways that couldn't be repaired. Trust, once eroded, didn't return after the verdict. There were no gatherings to restore normalcy, no shared efforts to rebuild what had broken. Each person retreated into their own version of the story, unable to reconcile it with the documented truth presented in court. What remained wasn't anger, but distance that felt deliberate and permanent. I retained control of the trust exactly as the legal structure required. Yet holding that authority didn't feel like a victory. It felt like responsibility accepted with clarity rather than celebration. I chose to sever contact with my family, not as retaliation but as a necessary boundary. Continuing relationships built on denial would have compromised everything the process had clarified. Walking away was the only way to ensure the cycle didn't repeat under a different excuse. 6 months after the verdict, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop in a city I'd never lived in before. I'd moved, started over, built a life that belonged entirely to me. No expectations, no accommodations, no silent compromises that chipped away at who I was. A woman at the next table smiled at me. We started talking, just casual conversation about nothing important. At some point, she asked if I had family nearby. I paused, considered the question. Not anymore, I said. She nodded, understanding in a way that suggested her own story had chapters I'd recognize. Sometimes that's the healthiest choice, she said quietly. And God, hearing someone say that out loud without judgment, without trying to fix it or explain it away, it made something inside me settle. I thought about my grandfather then, about how he'd built protections into that trust decades ago, anticipating a future he'd never see. He'd understood something fundamental about families and control and the ways people justify cruelty in the name of loyalty. He'd built a system that couldn't be manipulated by authority or intimidation or emotional leverage. He'd protected me before I even knew I needed protecting. And in doing that, he'd given me something more valuable than money. He'd given me proof that I deserved protection, that my boundaries mattered, that compliance wasn't the same as love. The legal battle taught me things I'll carry forever. Long-term compromise doesn't create peace when fairness is consistently denied. It only teaches those in power that imbalance carries no consequence. Law exists to protect individuals who lack authority within their own families, especially when loyalty is used as leverage. Boundaries only matter when they're enforced through deliberate action, rather than silent endurance. I learned that walking away isn't failure. It's clarity. That silence can be more powerful than any argument. That sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones who understand you least. Last month, I received a letter from Vanessa. It wasn't an apology. It was an attempt to reconnect, framed as concern about my isolation. She wrote about family being forever, about forgiveness, about moving past differences. She never once mentioned what had actually happened. The lunch, the ultimatum, the violation. It was as if acknowledging the truth would make it more real than it already was. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say to someone who refused to see what they'd done. The relationship we might have had died the moment they chose control over honesty, and I wasn't interested in resurrecting something that had been broken at its foundation. My life now is quieter, smaller in some ways, larger in others. I answer to no one but myself. I make decisions based on what feels right, not what keeps others comfortable. I've learned to recognize red flags I used to ignore, patterns I used to excuse, dynamics I used to accept as normal. And I've learned that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of honesty. Real, uncomfortable, liberating honesty. To everyone who stayed until the end of this story, thank you. I know it wasn't easy to hear. It wasn't comfortable. It didn't wrap up neatly with reconciliation or forgiveness. But real life rarely does. Stories like this aren't shared to seek validation, but to offer perspective. To show that you're not crazy for recognizing dysfunction. That you're not cruel for enforcing boundaries. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to see you as fully human. If you have thoughts or a different viewpoint, feel free to share them in the comments. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And if you're sitting there right now, wondering if you're wrong for wanting to leave a situation that's breaking you down piece by piece, let me tell you something. You're not wrong. Trust yourself. Protect yourself. And remember that family is supposed to be a safe place, not a cage. When it becomes a cage, you have every right to find the key and walk out. My name is Rebecca. I walked away from a family that loved control more than they loved me, and I've never been freer.